I'm using simple methods and materials and my own two hands to make dollhouse miniatures from scratch. Previously, I began decorating my cardboard room box, and today I'm decorating the opposite wall. I got a few bundles of scrap wood at my local dollhouse store for $1 each, and I'm using some of the pieces to make a shelf to the left of the fireplace. I'm not sure what this piece of trim is intended for, but I like that it has a 90-degree angle and it provides the back and the top of the shelf. I'm making 3 accessories entirely by hand to display on the shelf, and I love how they all turn out. I'm using this piece of crown molding to make 2 brackets for the shelf by cutting 2 small slices. I'm using my miter shears, but you could also use a small saw or a craft knife. Before I attach the shelf brackets, I'm using my X-Acto knife to break up these clean lines and make the shelf look more rustic. To make the top shelf deeper so I can display more miniatures, I glued on this piece of wood, leaving some overhang in the front. The shelf will have 3 pegs, so I guesstimated where they should be and then glued in some pieces of toothpick. If you don't have a drill, you can glue the pieces of toothpick directly to the shelf, but they may not be quite as strong. To make these random bits of wood look more cohesive and to give it an old look, I'm doing a multi-part paint process. I'm starting with a dark brown base coat, which could either be an old layer of paint or maybe the stained underlying wood. For the main color, I'm using dark blue pale from Vallejo. Most of my paints are cheap acrylic paints, but I do have 4 nice bottles of paint, and this is one of them. I'm applying the paint lightly, making sure some of the brown is still visible. I want the shelf to give off those covered in lead paint vibes, so I'm using a metal tool to scrape away some of the paint. I wanted more dimension and depth, so I'm just dry brushing on some cream paint to highlight some of the textures and also make it look like there are at least 3 layers of paint on this one shelf. I'm really digging the rustic look, but it looks a little too clean, so I'm adding some watered down brown paint to add some grime. Sometimes this step looks like a mistake, but you can always remove some of the excess and remember that the wash dries a lot more subtle than it looks when it's wet. Now that the shelf is done, we can move on to the main attraction and start making some accessories. While I was working on the shelf, I had no idea what I was going to hang on it, but I was watching a show called It Bit Me about animal attacks. Somebody got attacked by a bear and it gave me the idea of making a bear trap. I used my hammer to flatten the rounded rim of an aluminum baking tray lid, and now I'm cutting it into a narrow strip. The foothold trap has 2 halves that have serrated teeth, so I folded the aluminum in half and put some tape around it so I can cut both sides at the same time. I'm using the handle of a rather large paintbrush to get the correct semicircle shape for each side. I used super glue for the entire project and made the 2 halves into one circle. Then I bent to this small L-shaped piece and glued it to the outside of the circle in the middle. I used a combination of super glue and baking soda to reinforce all the joints and added this small piece across the middle. I used my hole punch to punch out a small circle and added a small amount of Q-tip to make the trigger plate stand up off of the backing. I finished the construction of the trap by adding a small amount of jewelry chain from an old broken necklace. I'm prepping the trap for paint by adding a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. Whenever I'm painting something non-porous like metal or something like plastic, I like to add Mod Podge to the paint to help it stick. I'm using Dirty Down Rust from Goblin's Hut to make the entire trap rusty. I really like this product because it's water-based, so I can clean my brush with just normal water and it creates real rust through a chemical reaction. I paid $28 for less than an ounce, which is kind of crazy, but it seems to be lasting forever even though I use it all the time, and I'll definitely buy more when I run out. I absolutely love how this turned out, and I'm really happy with the black spots I added, which add a lot more depth and age. I'm hanging the trap from a hook and covering the top of the shelf with some dishes. I'm using super glue to create some stacks, but I want some gaps and irregularities, so I'm adding some small pieces of aluminum between a couple of the plates. I did the same with the stack of bowls and the mugs. I think the red is a little too vibrant for the space, so I'm painting everything with a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. Once the black base coat dried, I followed it up with some silver metallic paint. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but I think they actually may have looked better if I had left them the red spatterware. To tone down the red, I could have used a thin coating of Mod Podge mixed with some brown paint. I considered removing the paint with some nail polish remover, but instead I decided to move on and repair this old lantern I've had for quite a while by adding this glass ball to it. I glued all the accessories to the top of the shelf, and now I'm using this metal filigree piece to make a fireplace bellows. A fireplace bellows is used to blow air on a fire to either start a fire or save a fire that's about to burn out. I'm using this fancy metal piece on the front of the bellows for some added decor, but it's a little too wide, so I'm trimming off some of the excess with my pliers. I'm tracing the shape onto the rounded end of a popsicle stick to minimize how many cuts I have to make. I cut out 2 of the shapes and stained them brown with watered down paint. To give the bellows its distinctive tapered shape, I'm adding some small pieces of styrofoam tray so the ends will touch each other but the top part will have a gap. I'm using this piece of paper bag to look like the pieces of leather that join the 2 sides of a bellows. To make the paper bag look more like leather, I'm adding a coat of matte Mod Podge. Before the Mod Podge completely dried, I gently squeezed it to make the paper look more like the cracked leather you see on a bellows. I'm using a couple small pieces of mat board to make the handles. Mat board is made from layers of paper, so I'm removing a couple layers so the handles will sit nicely on the surface. To save me a little trouble once I start painting, I colored the edges with a black marker. The handle is pretty flat, which looks fine, but to make it look a little better and give it some dimension, I'm adding some wood glue. Wood glue does a great job of holding its shape as it's drying, as opposed to Elmer's glue, which tends to deflate and creates divots. I learned this trick from Aira from Bentley House Minis. Normally the handles would be part of the body, but that would have been a complete nightmare to cut, so hopefully these end up looking like wood and save me a lot of headache. I like to take the easy route on certain tasks like this that won't matter much in the end. The Mod Podge is completely dry, so I'm making the paper bag look more like leather by adding a thin wash of watered down brown paint. I'm removing the excess so the wash will settle in the deepest parts and hopefully add more dimension. To really highlight all of the textures of the paper, I'm dry brushing some cream paint. I love the huge difference this simple step makes. I want the bellows to look like it's covered in soot, but I was a little too heavy-handed with the black acrylic paint and I had to remove the excess with a damp paper towel. I probably should have used chalk pastels for the shading instead and practiced the technique on the back instead of the front. The only thing the bellows is missing is the tip where the air comes out. I carefully made a small hole at the end and shoved a small amount of toothpick in there. I wrapped a teeny piece of paper around the end and painted it so it looks metallic. When you're making something from scratch, it's a good idea to Google so you can have a reference image to work from. I've never used a bellows or seen one in real life, but I was making this entire thing from memory right until the end. I had this creepy feeling I was forgetting some kind of detail, so I finally Googled it, and that's when I added the air spout. I finished it off with a small amount of embroidery floss for hanging, and now I'm ready to make the third accessory. I'm making a miniature hearth broom to hang on the center peg, and that starts with a small bit of rope. I want this rope to end up looking like straight bristles on a broom, so I'm untwisting the different strands. I used a metal fork to comb out the threads, and now I'm using my hair straightener to straighten them out. I'm not sure if these fibers are natural or synthetic, so to avoid melting them, I'm using the hair straightener at a medium setting and keeping it moving. I keep my hair straightener with my hot glue gun, so that should give you an idea of how often I do my hair. I trimmed the fibers so they're straight across the top and used a combo of hot glue and wire to attach them to the broom handle. I also trimmed some of the excess length from the fibers and glued them into the center to add more volume to the broom. I used some red embroidery floss to add some details to the bristles, and now I'm trimming them. The bristles of a hearth broom can go straight across like a standard broom, but they can also be tapered so they're shorter on the edges and longer in the center. I've already made a broom with a more traditional shape, so I'm going for the tapered look. As I'm trimming the bristles, I'm doing a small amount at a time so I don't accidentally cut away too much. On the back of the broom there are knots from the embroidery thread, so I'm making sure I cut the bristles so they look good from a certain angle, which is the part that will be displayed when I hang the broom. If you do make a mistake, you can always take some loose bristles and glue them into place and trim them once they're dry. Speaking of trimming, I'm cutting off the extra handle length and drilling a new hole for hanging. The longer handle length would have made the broom bristles hang too low and interfere with some plans I have for decorating the space under the shelf later. Since these small brooms are used for sweeping ashes away from your fireplace, I'm adding some black chalk pastels to look like soot. And here's a glimpse of the naughty backside. For a little more depth, I kissed just the tips of the bristles with a small amount of black paint. I obviously haven't learned my lesson because I started this on the front and I should have tested the technique on the back first. But I lucked out this time because I really like how the black paint looks. I think that was the perfect finishing touch, so now I'm preparing a space on the wall for the shelf. I often age things in place after I add them to the space, but it'll be really hard to add any shading around the shelf once it's glued in, so I'm doing it now. I'm starting with brown chalk pastels to add both what will look like dirt and also a shadow. In a previous video, I used strips of cereal box to make these faux wood paneling walls. Cereal box seems smooth, but once you paint it and start rubbing chalk pastels over the surface, you notice that it has a subtle horizontal texture. The chalk pastels get stuck in these grooves, and it either looks like the grain of the wood or maybe even saw marks from when the boards were milled. To make it look like the items on the shelf are casting a shadow, I'm adding some black chalk pastel, and I actually added more than I show here. To make it look like the bear trap has swung on the wall and left a mark, I traced the path with a pencil and then I added some black and brown chalk pastels. I think little details like this add to the realism and tell a story. I'll show you some more things from the cardboard room box later, but for now I'm jumping back to my miniature abandoned lab inside of a book. To decorate the desk in the abandoned lab, I used amazing mold putty to create a mold of plastic test tubes. I'm filling the mold with UV resin and a metal wire I painted black to make it look like there's something inside the glass test tubes. I made a third test tube that's plain resin. To make a stand, I drilled 3 holes in a skinny stick. I'm staining it with brown paint mixed with rubbing alcohol. I cut 3 pieces of plastic canvas to make the rest of the stand and glued it in a U shape. I painted it black to look like metal and added the wooden piece to the top. For the final piece, I added one of my favorite miniatures, which is this small realistic pen, and I didn't want to commit to gluing it down, so I added it with wax. My favorite types of miniatures tend to be small, mundane things that make a scene look a lot more realistic. The top of the cabinet looks pretty empty, so I'm adding a stack of rags from a cut-up t-shirt. I'm aging the rags with some watered down black paint, and I'm aging the cabinet with some Mod Podge mixed with brown paint. I allow the paint and Mod Podge mixture to dry and then wipe it away with a damp paper towel. The Mod Podge makes it resistant to being wiped away, so it ends up looking like dirt that's been building up over the years. I also used this paint and Mod Podge combo to age the glass and the white sink. It is so satisfying to me how gross this sink looks. I had some left over, so I added some underneath the cabinets as well to cast a shadow and add another layer of grime. Miniatures don't tend to cast their own realistic shadows, so it makes it look a lot better when you add them artificially yourself. It works like forced perspective and gives these cabinets and shelves some weight. To take up some space under the desk, I'm aging this old Prison Bond stool. I'm adding the same paint and Mod Podge mixture to the stool and then wiping away some of the excess. I'm trying a paint crackle technique by adding some wet glue and adding wet paint right over top of it before the Elmer's glue dries. I'm laying the paint on heavy and trying to minimize my brush strokes to avoid disturbing the drying glue underneath. I used a heat gun to make it warped and distorted and cause some bubbles in the paint. It looks way too clean, so I'm adding some brown paint and I'll mostly wipe away the excess. I'm finishing the stool by lifting up some of the paint using a sewing pin so it looks like the paint is flaking off. I'm about ready to fill the sink with resin water, so I'm breaking up some plaster and gathering moss and other debris to add to the sink. I started by adding a small amount of UV resin to the sink and I'm adding the debris. This sink is right under the water-damaged ceiling, so I want it to look like water has filled the sink and pieces of the broken ceiling. I'm finishing with another layer of UV resin to seal it all in. Now I'm making one of my favorite things I've ever made. Use Dollar Tree materials to make realistic foam stones and a flickering fire. I'm using a battery-operated tea light with a flickering light that mimics fire. You can find these in a 2-pack at the Dollar Tree, especially around Halloween because they're sold for jack-o'-lanterns. I'm removing the plastic flame for more realism and so I have room to add some logs later. I'll add this piece to my bit box and try to find a new use for it in a different project. The tea light is 1.5 inches across, which is the equivalent of 18 inches in 1/12 scale. I'm beefing it up with some cardboard. I cut at a height of 7/8 of an inch. This will give us more space to create the faux stone wall on the outside and the fire in the center. Also, I think tea lights are a pretty distinctive size and shape, so if we don't alter it in some way, people may be able to look at this project and immediately know it's a tea light. When I'm upcycling things to make miniatures, I like to disguise the origins to completely transform it. Wrapping 2 layers of cardboard around the outside increased the diameter to about 2 inches instead of 1.5. The stones will add even more size. I'm using some leftover foam core I got from the Dollar Tree. The Dollar Tree brand foam core is really good to use for making stones because the paper backing is easily removed, unlike the stuff you can get at Walmart or Michael's. I cut a piece of foam core at the same height as the cardboard. I'm using 1 layer of foam and cutting the ends to meet one another. If you have any bulging areas or cracks, you can secure them with more hot glue. I covered up the cardboard because I'm carving the look of stones into the foam core. I decided to create the look of 3 layers of relatively flat stones. I did consider doing multiple layers of very flat stone, kind of like slate or shale. You could also skip doing the look of stones and do brick instead by making rectangles. I was planning on 3 layers of stones, but some of mine are a bit skinny, so a 4th layer fits. Don't stress yourself out over this step because we're adding a lot of details that will obscure any mistakes, and this is just Dollar Tree foam on a tea light, so it's not that serious. By the end, it's hard to even see the seam where the 2 ends of the foam meet, and this large crack looks pretty cool. Once I established the positions of the stones, I went around with a pen and pressed along the borders to round the edges. You could use a pencil for this as well, you just need something that tapers at the end. The stones already look more dimensional and rounded. To prepare for the next step, make sure your foam doesn't extend beyond the cardboard. I'm using more foam to create flat stones for the top of the wall. I cut a strip of foam core about 3/4 of an inch wide, and I'm cutting one end with a slight curve. I'm cutting a small bit off of each side at an angle so the stone slightly tapers. I'm adding about 1/8 of an inch of overhang around the edges so the stones aren't flush with the sides. I used the first stone I cut as a pattern to cut 2 more about the same shape and size. The scissors leave some pretty clean lines, so I'm squeezing the edges of the stone to make it look more organic. The stones will be arranged like this, which is why the sides need to be tapered. I made more stones using previous stones as templates and kept dry fitting them in place to make sure I was on the right track. I'm gluing down my foam stones using a combination of white glue and hot glue. I added a circle of white glue around the middle, and I'm adding 2 little dabs of hot glue for each stone so it can hold it in place while the white glue sets. The space for the final stone is a little bit bigger than the ones I've been using, so I cut a custom stone to fit. You could call your stones done at this stage and start painting them, but I want a whole lot more dimension. I'm using my craft knife to cut away pieces of the stone to make them less uniform. I'm visually setting this stone back by cutting off the entire face. I'm using these tweezers with a thin taper tip to pull chunks out of the stones. I forgot to do it, but you can add texture with crumpled up aluminum foil and real rocks as well. I'm dragging the pointed tweezers and poking the end into the stones, and I really like how this looks once it's painted. The bottoms of the stones are squared off, so I'm cutting a taper to round them. I really like the shape of the stones, but now I need to address the lack of texture. The foam is really smooth, so I'm decoupaging some torn toilet paper to the surface. If you decide to skip this step, coat your stones in a mixture of Mod Podge and paint or white glue and paint. Otherwise, it can be difficult to paint the plasticky foam because subsequent layers of paint pull off previous layers. You could try a couple different techniques, but what worked for me was laying down a section of white glue and adding small bits of toilet paper to the surface. Right now I'm just looking to cover the face of the stones, but I'm not pushing the edges of the toilet paper down yet. Now this little section is covered, so I'm using a finger dipped in some watered down glue to press down the edges of the toilet paper. I used my finger to press it onto the surface and a smaller tool to push it into the cracks. Once it's painted, you'll see all the texture the toilet paper created, and it also helps stiffen the foam and add strength. For the top stones, I did a slightly different method by covering all sides of the stones with glue and adding larger pieces of toilet paper that could wrap around the front and the back. I'm using a paintbrush dipped in watered down glue to press the toilet paper into place. I tucked the toilet paper on the inner rim and pressed it down between the stones before addressing the outside. I made sure the edge of the stones were covered and pulled off some of the excess. After I laid down a sheet of toilet paper and pressed in the cracks, I used my finger to pull the toilet paper over the surface to create wrinkles. For more texture, I sprinkled it with white sand, but I was very heavy-handed and ended up removing a lot of it with a damp paintbrush. I think less is more if you'd like to add sand. I sped up the dry time with a hairdryer, so now it's time to add color. I'm painting the entire inner rim underneath the stones with black. These stones will ultimately be gray, but I like to start with a warm base coat so it looks more realistic and has more depth. I coated all of the stones with unbleached titanium. You can make your own neutral color by mixing a little bit of brown and yellow into some white. I'm adding color to the stones with yellow ochre, phthalo blue, red ochre, gray, and burnt sienna. I'm watering down the paints to create a wash. For each of the colors, I'm adding them to the stones in a random manner. I like to start with the yellow because it's the lightest and work my way up from there. I started by partially covering some of the stones with the yellow, and now I'm mixing in some bits of burnt sienna and even some blue. Using phthalo blue probably seems a bit kooky, but this doesn't end up looking blue in the end. The blue will eventually read more like gray. For more realism, I'm using multiple shades of color on most of the stones because stones have different variation even within the same stone. This looks a bit crazy now, but it dries a lot more subtle since it's just a paint wash and not opaque paint. The paint is dry, so I'm dry brushing with some more unbleached titanium. This dry brushing is a very small amount of paint that hits the highest points on the stones and emphasizes the texture. The dry brushing on the top stones emphasizes the wrinkles I created when I pushed the toilet paper back and forth while it was still wet. If your faux stones are looking like Fruit Loops, you're on the right track. I base coated all the stones with unbleached titanium, added color with some washes, dry brushed unbleached titanium, and now I'm adding a dark wash. This is black acrylic paint mixed with water. I'm covering all the stones with this black wash, making sure it gets into the deepest parts of the stones. The dark wash helps neutralize some of the colorful washes we added earlier. I dry brushed before this step because the light tips of the stones add more depth once the wash dries. You can see the dark wash looks a lot more subtle once it dries. This already looks pretty cool, but I think it looks even better when you create the illusion of more depth by adding some dark wash in between the stones. As a final step, I'm lightly dry brushing some more unbleached titanium. Look at the surface of each stone and you can see how the different colored washes made them look more like natural stone than if you added just a coat of gray paint. My favorite thing to add to outdoor stones is flocking. I got this faux moss sponge-like material at my local hobby store. I'm mixing my flocking with glue. I learned the hard way, but it's best to squeeze the air out of the glue bottle before you add it to the flocking so you don't blow it all over the place. To make it a tiny bit easier to mix and let it spread a little further, I added a touch of water. I think the easiest way to apply this little concoction is with your finger. I'm pressing the flocking and glue mixture mostly into the cracks. I'm not sure if moss even grows on fire pits since they get really hot, but I did choose this subdued green color, so maybe it is moss that is dying or at least isn't flourishing. I'm avoiding adding any moss to areas that have my favorite bit of texture. I used all of my restraint and didn't fill every single crack with the flocking. I'm mixing up a much tinier amount of the bright green flocking. I could have subdued this bright green color by adding some of the brownish flocking. I'm adding the green moss to the bottom of the stones since this would be the coolest section of the fire pit and it's closest to the ground, so I imagine it's where the liveliest moss would be growing. Maybe some moisture would collect on the underside of the stones, so I'm adding the bright green moss there as well. I only did it on a few stones, so it's not completely overdone. While that dries, I'm making the fire. Before I did anything, I had the foresight to trace my tea light onto a piece of paper so I can make a pattern. I folded the template in quarters so I can cut a tidy circle out of the center to accommodate the light bulb. I made 2 attempts, failed to cut a circle, and later you'll see I didn't even need to do this, so I've embarrassed myself for nothing. This little template really came in handy because I was able to simultaneously work on the fire pit and the fire for the center separately. This flimsy paper piece is merely a pattern, so I'm gluing it to a more substantial piece of food packaging. I can't fold this piece of chipboard into quarters, so I'm doing the clever thing and using a hole punch to cut out the center. I'm using this as a base to create a faux fire so the bright paper doesn't work. To avoid waiting for paint to dry, I'm coloring it in with a marker. You won't really see much of this in the end, but if there is some peeking through, it'll look a lot better than the stark white. I was planning to use the same Sharpie to fake the look of charred wood on some sticks from my burn pile, but then I decided let's just go for the real thing. I made the world's most minuscule fire in our fire pit outside and salvaged some of the pieces. I trimmed them to size before the fire. Since these were actually on fire, they're covered in soot, so I'm locking it in using some ultra matte sealer. I painted one of the logs in an orderly manner and then squeezed some sealer on the rest and knocked them about with my paintbrush. I did this in a very disorderly manner and quite messily, and it turned out great, so I suggest it. Before the sealer is completely dry, I'm dipping the logs into some white chalk pastels to mimic the look of dry, ashy wood. Some of the little sticks really did have charred ends, and the sealer actually did a great job of preserving it. I think it's funny that I rescued these sticks from my burn pile, ended up burning them anyway, but now they get to be a part of this little art forever. I'm attaching the sticks with hot glue and arranging them in kind of a triangular pattern around the center. I'm making sure to provide some clearance in the center so the bulb isn't hitting one of the sticks. I burned some more sticks so I could steal the bark off of them to fill in all the gaps around the edges. I harvested the charred bark by rolling the sticks in my fingers, which is why I'm pretty ashy. I used a brush to pounce on some more of the sealer and sprinkled some white chalk pastel over the entire fire pit, concentrating around the edges. I'm patting the loose chalk pastel into the surface. It already looks so realistic and I'm not even done yet. If you give it a hearty sniff, you can smell the charred wood, but the sealer did a great job of locking in the ashes and the chalk pastel. I love the look of the sticks, but it looks like a burned down fire, so now I'm creating some flames. I sprayed some trash plastic with some rubbing alcohol to clean off any oils or grease. I was planning to draw the look of flames using an orange Sharpie, but it probably would have looked like something a 90s kid would have doodled on a notebook, so instead I wet a brush with some rubbing alcohol to obscure the lines. I'm using a damp brush just to push the ink around on the plastic surface. I could have added another color like yellow, which maybe would have looked good, but I didn't think of it at the time. This still didn't look very great, but it ends up working out really well, so good enough. I cut off a piece about 3/4 of an inch wide and used some scissors to cut stereotypical looking flames across the top. I softened the plastic with some heat and wrapped it around the handle of a hole punch to give it a slight curve. The heat ended up curling the tips of my flames, but I ended up cutting most of that off. I made 3 pieces but only used one of the smallest pieces. I covered the corrugated cardboard edges of the bottom using some of the leftover paper I pulled off the foam earlier. I left the middle open so I can access the on and off button and swap out the batteries. This stone technique was really easy and could be used on a lot of things like a stone wall, a fountain, and even a patio. I kept the flame short and I like how the light reaches the cut ends and makes it look pretty realistic. The flames can be easily removed because I just tuck them in between logs. Now we're hopping back into the cardboard room box to decorate another wall. I've been transforming my cardboard room box I built into an antique kitchen, and I've gotten a lot of great viewer suggestions, so today I'm doing one of them and making some snowshoes. I'll show you an easily accessible alternative material you can use to make the snowshoes, but I'll be using this rattan I got at my local dollhouse store. This particular product is made by Real Life Miniatures and it's vintage. The pieces of rattan are flexible right out of the package, so I can just bend this into the shape I need. Antique snowshoes are really curvy, kind of like a tennis racket, so it's really important to have a flexible material. To be extra tenacious, I sprayed the rattan with water before bending it into the shape I like. I'm using a combination of wood glue and wire to help it hold the shape as it dries. I don't know if it'll make a difference, but I sprayed the rattan with water in the hopes that as it dries in this curved shape, there will be less tension on the glue joint. I'm assuming most of you don't have a bag of rattan from 1982, so I'll show you how to do this with cheap bamboo skewers I got from the Dollar Tree. I'm starting by splitting the bamboo skewer as close to half as I can because it's too thick as it is right now. I used a combination of my miter shears and utility knife. Now I have 2 halves of a circle which are kind of shaped like a crescent, so I'm using my utility knife to shave some of the hard edges off to make it look more like a round dowel again. First, I shave one of the hard edges and then I flip the skewer around to shave the other side. I'm not looking for perfection, but I don't want to have really thick parts that might be harder to bend than the areas around them because the bamboo skewer might break at that point. Here's a comparison to show how much thinner the shaved bamboo skewer is. Even this thinner bamboo skewer still won't bend without breaking, so the secret is soaking it. I soaked mine in hot water for about 2 hours, and remember to soak both at the same time if you're making 2. I bent the skewer to see which direction it naturally wants to bend and then slowly bent it underwater. This little piece popped off, which isn't a big deal because I can just remove it and it still maintains the shape I need. This would have worked even better if I had let it soak for longer, and I heard adding vinegar can help as well. Bamboo skewers are really cheap and this method is easy, so I'd love to hear some ideas of what else we could make using this bent wood technique. Snowshoes have woven or laced webbing, usually made of rawhide, but to save myself the trouble of weaving anything, I'm using some burlap. To stiffen the burlap, I sprayed it down with water and now I'm adding some watered down glue. I probably should have mentioned it before now, but snowshoes are used to help distribute a person's weight over deep snow so their legs don't sink into the snow with every step they take. I don't want the glue obscuring the woven texture, so I'm using my paintbrush to spread it out evenly. I dried it quickly with my hairdryer, but before I add the webbing, I want to add some cross beams. On full-size snowshoes, these help keep the thing from breaking, but in my case, they'll add some detail. Both of the snowshoes need the same size cross beams, so I cut them at the same time as one another before installing to make sure they're the same size. If I was making these again, I would eliminate the larger cross beam that's in the middle and just have this little one at the bottom and the one at the top. This would make the woven portion of the snowshoe a little bigger and probably be more realistic. Before I cut out my burlap pieces, I'm adding some color with some chalk pastels, although this mostly goes away because I never set it with anything. To preserve the color, when you use chalk pastel, you can spray it with hairspray or a matte setting spray. Using a marker, I traced on the inside and cut out the shape I need. Before I attach the burlap, I'm using some thread and glue to give the illusion that the burlap is woven or sewn on. To start, I'm spreading a thin layer of glue, and now I'm using a sewing needle to wrap the thread around the frame at an angle, kind of like the lines you would see on a candy cane. As I go along, I'm adding glue to the areas I'm about to wrap and also locking the thread in place that I've already wrapped. As I approach the crossbeam, I'm wrapping the thread around that rather than the outside of the frame. I'm adding another quick coat of glue, and then I'm wrapping the thread the same way but in the opposite direction so it makes a cross stitch on the outside of the frame. You don't need any sewing skills for this, since all I'm doing is just wrapping thread around the stick. You don't even necessarily need a sewing needle if you don't have one. You could tape your thread to a piece of wire, a straight pin, or even a toothpick. When I'm all finished wrapping, I tie the loose threads into a knot and secure them with glue. I'm easily attaching the stiffened burlap by adding some glue to the inside of the frame. I would have preferred to use thread that's a much closer match to the burlap, so it looks like the burlap pieces were woven and the extra threads are tied around the outside, but I didn't have any brown thread. To reduce the contrast between the maroon thread and the rattan, I'm coating the snowshoe with a wash of watered down brown paint. I'm adding some color to the burlap as well. I'm not sure of the function, but every snowshoe I've seen has this rectangular hole in the middle, so I'm lining up my snowshoes to make sure the holes align. This is the point in the build where I realized my woven section might be a little bit small because normally this rectangle is about 1/3 of the way down and I needed to center mine. Snowshoes have this little leather section with laces and a strap on the back so you can attach your feet to the snowshoes, so I'm making that now. A friend of mine makes knives with leather sheets, and he was nice enough to give me all of these leather scraps, so I'm searching for a piece that's the right color and the right thickness. I like how thin this maroon piece is, but I don't like the color, so instead I'm going to shave down this brown piece of leather to make it the correct thinness. This piece of leather has a pretty thick backside that kind of looks like suede, so I'm just using my X-Acto knife to slide across it and remove some of this fluffy bulk. There are tabletop machines and some hand tools available for doing the same thing, and they're called leather skivers. If you don't have leather, check out the description below for some alternatives, including a video showing how to make leather out of brown paper bag. It took me 5 minutes to do this little section, and I created this mess that looks like sawdust that I may use in a future workshop build. Now that the leather is much thinner and works in a 1/12 scale, I want to change the color and make it look older. Over time, leather wears down and creates faded areas, so I'm simulating that look using some sandpaper. This leather is really dark and I want it to look dry and cracked, so I'm lightly dry brushing over it using a light brown, making sure I don't kill all of the dark areas between the leather texture. I sketched a simple template, and after putting it in place, I trimmed it so it'll be a better fit. To make sure each side is symmetrical, I fold the template in half before trimming it. I only made one piece of thin leather and I don't want to have to do it again, so any mistakes and adjustment I make I would like to do on this piece of paper rather than my leather. I barely shaved enough leather to fit 2 of my template pieces, and if I didn't have enough I would have just made my template smaller rather than shaving more. I'm using more of this aluminum tray lid to attach the foothold leather to the snowshoe. I used Fabri-Tac to attach the aluminum to the leather, and I'm putting it on the part where your boot would be standing on it if you were lacing these around your boot. I added some more Fabri-Tac, which is the clear glue you see, and I'm folding the aluminum so it has a really clean edge. This is the part that'll be glued to the snowshoe, so you won't end up seeing this on the underside. To make it look like this metal is riveted to the leather, I'm making some indents with my Dollar Tree ball stylus. This looks really good just as it is, but to add a little more detail, I'm adding a few caviar beads that are meant for decorating your nails. I'm adding a small dab of glue to each indent and picking up a caviar bead on the end of my ball stylus. This added detail will become more easily visible once I add the paint. I'm starting with some matte Mod Podge mixed with a small amount of brown paint. This first step adds some color and will also help keep the tiny caviar beads from popping out of place. This looks good as it is and you can stop here, but I'm adding an entire coat of my favorite paint, which is Dirty Down Rust. This time it didn't give the same effect it usually does because I used a wet paintbrush to scrape it off the side after I didn't secure the cap well enough the last time I used it. Dirty Down Rust is a chemical reaction that creates rust, and since I used a watered down paintbrush to apply it, it didn't dry as light as it normally does, so I'm toning the whole thing down with a little bit of silver paint. I mostly did this next part off camera, but imagine me holding this an inch from my face while cursing and very carefully lacing it while trying not to tear the thin leather. I made 2 of them, but if you look closely you'll see I accidentally laced them up differently from one another. Since my woven area is a little small, I had to make the rectangular hole bigger, and I'm patching the back with an extra piece of dry burlap. Every time I make miniatures, I make mistakes and things don't turn out the way I wanted, but it always looks fine in the end, so just have fun and don't sweat the small stuff. The laced up part holds the front of the boot, but it needs a strap to hold the back. To attach the strap, I glued one side and I'm cutting off the extra. I'm gluing down the other side and I made a simple buckle using some bent wire. I'm using a Sharpie marker to tone down the bright silver so it better matches my antique snowshoe. I used white glue to attach a caviar bead rivet in the buckle to the strap. I'm dry brushing the laces with some light brown paint to make it look faded instead of brand new. With the darker brown paint, I'm adding some shadows where the laces meet the burlap and some shadows underneath the cross beams. Miniatures don't cast their own shadows, so I like to add some artificial shadows using some shading to make them look more realistic. I'm happy with how these turned out, but now I have a dilemma. Previously, I used a pretty strong glue to attach this metal pot rack to the cereal box paneling on the right side of the room box. Should I remove the pot rack to instead hang the snowshoes, or should I find somewhere else to put them or just hang them from the rack? Let me know in the comments what you think. Just a quick update on the bamboo skewer. It's completely dry and it created the exact same shape as the rattan, so you could definitely make this project even if you don't have the vintage material I found. I love the look of these antique snowshoes, and now I'm making an antique refrigerator.
I used popsicle sticks and other junk to make an ice box with working doors. The inspiration is this plastic Krisenbahn ice box kit. The dimensions are listed at the bottom, which makes it easier to recreate. I marked the dimensions on my craft paper, but I need to subtract the thickness of one stick from the top. I won't go into too much details about how I created this pattern since I'll list the dimensions in the description and I have a lot of fun details I want to focus on. I'm sketching out each of the individual pieces so it'll be easy to measure and cut them. I'm using miter shears to trim the popsicle sticks. I need space to add a popsicle stick going across the top, so I'm trimming the side sticks to fit. Numbering your pattern in your pieces can help keep you organized. I want to create a larger opening for the top door, so I'm removing about 1/8 of an inch of popsicle stick from the top piece. I'm nipping 2 of the cuts using my miter shears and finishing the cut using a craft knife. I get a lot of questions about my miter shears, so I link them in the description and in the comment section below if you'd like a pair of your own. I cut the middle piece that separates the 2 doors to be the same length as the bottom piece to keep the unit square. The center divider is a bit too thick, so I used a combo of my miter shears and sandpaper to make it thinner. I'm creating a decorative design for the number 2 piece and easily finding the center using a piece of folded paper. I marked the piece of wood at the same place the fold is on the piece of paper. I'm using some really cheap files to create my design. I'm starting with this pointy triangle type file right in the middle where I made my mark. I find using files is so much easier than using a craft knife and trying to cut intricate designs. I used a round file on each of the ends and my miter shears to remove a lot of the bulk in between the designs. You can see the curves starting to form, but there are a bunch of hard edges I'm softening with sandpaper. The edge of the pattern is straight up and down, so I added a curved bevel using some sandpaper. I cut a 6th piece that goes above the bottom piece using a coffee stir stick. I glued all of the joints according to my pattern over a piece of wax paper so it doesn't stick to the paper. I'm checking that all the joints are square using a Lego. I finished the face frame by adding the 6th and final piece. I used the same techniques to create 2 side panels. I agonized for a few minutes about whether I should add a horizontal piece of coffee stir stick. Let me know what you think, but I decided against it. I cut all of the pieces for the 2 side panels at the same time before gluing them together. I used a larger popsicle stick to close the side panels. I sanded the faces of each of the pieces to remove the pencil marks and make them more even. I'm assembling the front and side with a little help from my friends. I have a nice pile of scraps from a laser cut Dollhouse Miniature kits. I cut this bit of scrap into 4 pieces to ensure the front panels are perfectly square. I'm cutting a back panel using foam core with the same inner dimensions as the front. I used some more foam core to cut some shelves. You can use wood for the entire construction if you like, but I only used wood on the areas I'll be staining. I prefer to use a cheap, easy to cut material like foam core for the interior pieces and back which will be painted. Tape or rubber bands would work well for this, but I'm using these adorable clamps I got a couple Christmases ago to hold the pieces together while they dry. To prep the walls for paint and smooth things out, I'm covering up the interior roughness using some scrap cardstock. I made the doors large enough to slightly overlap my openings. I need to fill each of the back panels with some more popsicle stick, but to make sure it doesn't overlap the interior of the door, I traced it from the inside. Sanding the entire face not only makes them more uniform, but will remove a lot of glue residue for staining later. The shelves and clamps stabilized the body, so I sanded the bottom flat. The popsicle sticks come together at the corner in a pretty sharp point, so I softened that as well. Let's all admire these smooth corners. I rounded the edge of the front doors as well to give them a slight bevel. To create the top, you can glue a combination of popsicle sticks together, but I'm using this scrap of basswood I've had for a while. I need some overhang on the front and sides, so I sketched out the approximate size I think I need. I rounded off the square edges of the top using some more sandpaper at about a 45-degree angle. This beveled edge adds a nice bit of detail. The laser cut scraps I used in each corner adds some surface area for the top to stick to. To add some stability and prevent warping, I glued some scrap pieces of popsicle stick to the underside of the top. I covered it up with more cardstock. I left it too much overhang because I'm adding a trim piece underneath the top. I'm mitering the corners by just eyeballing it. I trimmed the first piece with my craft knife at an angle I thought was about 45 degrees. I used my angle cut side piece to draw a line on the front piece so the edges meet nicely. I'm sorry I can't give better instruction on how to eyeball your miters like this, but it's something I learned with practice. Once I glued the pieces in place, I realized I cut the top a bit too wide and there's too much overhang. I was a little bit nervous to do it, but I sketched a line and trimmed off the excess. I rounded the edges to finish the cuts. I ran a bead of glue along all of the inside paper edges. Time for stain, and I'm choosing Waverly Antique Wax. I'm testing the color on the back of the door by brushing on the antique wax and wiping away the excess. I really like the color, although there are some areas that wood glue resisted the stain. I discovered Waverly Antique Wax through Tiny Keyhole Minis, and it's one of my favorite products. You could also use watered down brown acrylic paint or wood stain in a pen or jar. This is the first piece of 112 scale furniture I've ever made, so when I reached this stage of adding color, I got really excited. When I stained the top, there were a couple areas of glue repelling the stain, so I sanded it while the stain was still wet and added a new layer. This stuff is really forgiving because it just blended in very nicely. For a tiny bit of age and dimension, I brushed a small amount of black paint around all of the edges of the inside panels. I discovered some more glue repelling the stain, so I sanded and restained. Sanding took no time at all, and I think it was worth the effort to get such a nice result. I'm making the inside more uniform using some white acrylic paint. I didn't glue the back on until the very end, and it came in really handy because I needed to go inside of the icebox multiple times. I'm adding a thick layer of insulating foam to the doors using some foam core. I cut all 4 sides for each of the 2 foam core panels using an angled craft knife for added detail. I made one for each door. I knew I shouldn't do it, but I used real hinges and tiny nails to attach to the doors. First, I used some white glue to attach the hinges to the doors to hold them in place. Then I used a little pin to pre-drill a hole where the nail will go. These nails were too long, so I had to nip them a bit shorter. I used my pliers to press the nail into the small hole I created, and then used a second set of pliers to push it in the rest of the way. Fortunately for me, the inside of the icebox fit really well on the top of my 1-2-3 block, which enabled me to bang the nails in to attach the doors. This whole process took forever, and in the end, the top door was very crooked and I could never get it straight. There are some secrets for properly attaching tiny hinges, and apparently I don't know them. There's a large gap around 3 sides of the bottom door, which doesn't work well for a miniature fridge, so I removed that as well. I'm using some tape to hold the door in place while I try a new method. With my temporary tape method, both of the doors are sitting nice and flush against the front of the icebox. However, they will not stay closed. I'm solving that problem with these teeny tiny magnets I bought from Temu. These magnets are really strong and cute as a button. I used some super glue to attach 4 magnets on the inside. To make sure I glue the corresponding magnets in the right direction, I attached them together and then made a mark. I made a slight recess in the door using a drill bit, glued in the magnets, and covered them with brown paint. The system works really well, so I'm replacing the tape hinges using some fabric. Had I known how quick and easy the fabric and magnet combo would be, I would never have tried the real hinges to start with. I confirmed the fabric hinges work well, so it's time to attach the foam pieces. The metal hinges and tiny nails really sapped my patience and took up a lot of time, so I decided to add the foam panels using some double-sided tape. This enabled me to quickly add the foam panels without having to wait for any glue to dry. You could leave it just like this, but I'm disguising the fabric by staining it the same color as the exterior. I think this sort of tricks your eye into thinking the wooden door continues and makes my foam on the doors stand out a bit more. We know the real hinges are hidden on the inside, but I'm adding some faux hinges on the outside using some vintage Dresden trim. Dresden is die-cut paper-backed foil that's still being made today. Here I'm showing the piece wrapped around the door, but when I installed it, I cut them into 2 pieces and glued them separately. I am so in love with the 4 hinges, and I used more of the Dresden trim to make 2 latch looking things. This simulates the kind of hardware that hangs off the door and connects it to the cabinet. To protect the overhang, I added some wood glue. The wood glue dries really strong, so these pieces won't snap off. My foil pieces are just glued to the surface, but to make it look like they're attached with nails, I'm using some of this nail decor. I used tiny dabs of white glue to attach the studs to my faux hinges. For the latches, I switched from the larger size to the smaller ones. It's kind of impossible to see on camera, but I subdued the gold just a little bit with some antique gold rub and buff. I'm using some panel line accent color to emphasize the details in the Dresden trim and the tiny rivets. You could also substitute watered down acrylic paint. I really like how the wash settles in the details and adds dimension. To make the drip pan for the underside, I coated this piece of plastic with some ultra matte sealer and gave it a trim. I made it a lot shorter, but made sure to keep it tall enough so it's still visible under the decorative skirting. It was a bit too deep, so I trimmed the back. Adding the matte sealer helps the silver rub and buff stick very well. My fingers are dirty enough, so I applied it with a Q-tip. Ice boxes often have caster wheels at the bottom, but the casters I have are a bit undersized. I'm making my own super simple casters, starting with these really cheap beads I got at the Dollar Tree. I'm using a foil lid from a casserole dish to cut the sides that hold the wheels. I'm cutting an elongated shape with a rounded end that's slightly smaller than the bead so it's still visible. I used white glue to attach the glass beads to the foil. I'm filling the space and giving myself something to attach more foil to using some foam core. I added more foil so the foam is sandwiched in between the 2 pieces. I added a nail stud in the center to make it look like this is how the wheels are attached. Some black paint disguises the foam core. I attached the pieces with hot glue and used some black paint to age the drip pan. I used the 2 casters up front and stained pieces of chopstick in the rear. I just realized the top part that holds the ice block is supposed to be lined with galvanized metal, so I'm giving it a paint job. To simulate the look of galvanized steel, I started with a darker base coat followed by a lighter gray. To really make this look like galvanized metal, I'm stippling on a small amount of silver paint. The dabs of silver slightly catch the light. I created the galvanized look in the entire upper interior. I'm painting a bit of Popsicle Stick white to use as a shelf on the inside. I'm using this pretty glass ice block I got from Earth and Tree Miniatures. To fake the look of frost on the inside, I'm adding a bit of spackle into the corners and along the edges. Before allowing it to dry, I dampened the surface with some water and sprinkled on some white sand.
I would have added glitter, but I had already packed it since I was moving. Now I'm updating a super cheap miniature, which is so much fun to do. I'm making over a piece I bought at the Goodwill by the pound outlet for $2 a pound. I chose this piece because of the scale and the details, knowing the color can easily be changed. I'm holding this piece while I paint it using some tacky wax at the end of a colored pencil. To help the acrylic paint stick, I sanded the plastic and mixed some white glue into the paint. I'm not painting the entire inside since the plant will hide it. To create a bit of texture for the second coat, I'm using some baking soda, Mod Podge, and paint. I added some watered down white glue, but I actually prefer the thicker method. I chose a pretty warm color for the base because I'm adding a gray wash. I mixed up a bit of white paint, water, and black paint. When I'm creating something that looks like stone, I like to use a warm undertone or some kind of color rather than just stacking gray on gray. I prefer mixing just the flocking and glue and using. You can fill your pot with whatever you'd like, but I'm making a mini topiary that will be easy for you to replicate. I rolled a ball of aluminum foil, poked a hole, and filled it with hot glue. I'm using this dry stick from my burn pile to make the stem of my topiary. The second aluminum ball is slightly bigger and the hole goes all the way through it. I impulsively added some watered down white glue. I always keep scraps of clean aluminum foil for projects like this. I'm adding a layer of tacky glue to the top ball. White glue or wood glue would work just as well. While the glue is still wet, I'm dipping it into some flocking I got from a local hobby store. I added glue to the bottom ball and I'm covering that as well. Most topiaries have 3 balls, but I'm going with 2.
While the glue is still wet, I'm covering the topiary in rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension. I'm adding some watered down white glue in my final layer of flocking, which is this much finer, darker green color. Before I can plant my tree, I need to finish painting the base. I mixed up a wash of green paint, white paint, and some water. I'm adding this in areas moss may accumulate. I'm making a moss mixture using white glue and flocking. I impulsively added watered down white glue, but I'd skip it. I prefer mixing just the flocking and glue and using my finger to smear the thick mixture over the surface. I want this planter to look like it's been sitting outside, but I'm not going for an abandoned look. It took a lot of restraint not to add more moss since I accidentally mixed too much and I hate waste. Now it's time to plant my tree, so I added some hot glue and aluminum foil to the bottom. I poked a hole in the aluminum foil and added the stem using some hot glue. I'm creating the look of dirt by covering a layer of tacky glue with some used coffee grounds from a K-cup.
You can watch this video next to see how I furnished and accessorized a house that's less than 3 inches tall. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month.